You're listening to Art Destinations, a podcast where we host fortnightly conversations with artists and thinkers living and or working on islands to see how these unique places shape imaginations. This season will be set in Tasmania, following on from our Venice series. Hello, my name is Sarah Rhodes, an artist based in Lutruwita, Tasmania. I'm in conversation with Adam Thompson, a Pakana writer who sources much of the inspiration for his stories from his experiences working across the archipelago of Furneaux Islands between Lutruwita and mainland Australia. These islands are not only the backdrop for his dark moral tales, but they also hold his family history. We talk about his work as a builder and ranger on Badger, Chappell and Big Dog Islands that inspired his collection of short stories, Born Into This, as well as the TV series Moonbird to be screened on SBS channel NITV in 2025. Adam shares his writing process and how he sees his role as a father, imparting his cultural knowledge to his son. We are recording on Kanamaluka, the River Tamar, and you can see photographs of Adam on the islands on our Instagram page at artdestinations.podcast. Subscribe to Art Destinations on your hosting platform so you don't miss an episode, and even leave a review. Your contribution supports us. Welcome to Art Destinations, Adam. It's great to have you on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we met a few years ago when I was working on an arts project. You were really helpful in sharing some of your stories with me. And I thought it'd be really interesting for you to come on the show and talk about some of the stories that inspired the book Born Into This that you wrote or you published in 2021. Your experience on the islands of Badger Island, Big Dog Island, in the Furneaux group around Flinders Island. So first of all, I'd love to hear what took you to those islands.
Yeah, okay. Well, I've got a long family connection with those places. But I think what took me there more permanently was an opportunity that came up through the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre. I'd been living in Queensland for a while and I moved back to Tassie, and my uncle was doing a bit of building in the TAC and I was going in there helping him. And so after that I got offered some work over on the islands, which was really handy at the time because I didn't have a job. And so there's a whole group of us went over, and so Michael Mansell had the Dorothy Star, which was his boat, and then the TAC had a couple of shark cats. And so a whole big group of us went over and took all the building materials over for a land management hut that we were going to be building. And so they offered me a job to kind of be a builder's offsider with an Aboriginal builder by the name of Kerry Mansell. So we took all of the gear over and then I just stayed on and did some building, and I fell in love with the place. I've been to Flinders Island a few times before when I was younger, but this is the first time I'd kind of really been out to the outer islands.
So what's on those islands? Are the people living on those islands?
Well, we're talking about the Aboriginal-owned islands around kind of Flinders and Cape Barren. So in 1995, we got our first land return in Tasmania, and that consisted of about 12 parcels of land, and quite a few of those were islands in the Furneaux group. So there was Babel Island, Big Dog Island, Chappell Island and Badger Island. It was Chappell and Badger Islands that I was working at first. So that's where we built the land management hut on Chappell Island. And then we went on to build a kit home on Badger Island. And so, really interesting place. If anyone, knows anything about Chappell Island, it's well known for the tiger snakes that are there. And they're everywhere. It's kind of suffered a lot of degradation due to farming on the island. It's not a huge island, but it's got a big hill. It looks like a volcano. Yeah, and they had a sheep farm there years ago. And so all of the areas that the sheep farm, was on, which is most of the island, is now covered in boxthorn, African boxthorn, which is a terribly invasive weed, really spiky, thorny weed that's really hardy. And there's really soft soils over there, this really delicate muttonbird rookery that covers most of the island, and this boxthorn just covered the whole place. And so we were building a hut there because the TAC was starting a land management program, and they needed somewhere to house the workers. And going back to your question, there's no one living there at all. We built this 6x9 metre shed and kind of decked it out like a house, not like a real fancy house, but, enough for a crew of, at least 6 people to live in. Yeah, and then we went on to Badger Island and built a kit home. Yeah, so it was a really interesting time. And I spent, probably, I reckon at least 2 years all up building these 2 places. These islands are very remote. It's difficult to get gear there. Everything's got to be done by hand. Even when we were kind of squaring up the buildings to do the footings and everything, we were using these really crude techniques like water levels and all this stuff that Kerry knew all about, and we were doing that. And I learnt a lot. But, while we were there, it wasn't just about the building. You'd work during the day and then you'd knock off of the afternoon and just walk around and explore the island. And there's, like on Chappell Island, for example, this back in the heyday of mutton birding, this was one of the chief mutton bird islands. And there was many, many mutton bird sheds all around the coastline. And when I started working there in about 2001, there was only one mutton bird shed left. Hadn't been worked since the 80s, but it was still standing. And the rest of the sheds around the island were just remnants. You walk around the coastline and you find little coves, and if you explore in among the box soil and the vegetation, you find, these granite rocks that form, these square foundations and these kind of rough concrete slabs here and there, and piles of mutton bird bones and little bits of ceramics and things that are remnant from those sheds. And if you look back at the kind of historical records, you can find, these kind of hand-drawn maps with all of these sheds that were on there. And so there's amazing places to explore. And I would do that after work.
So if you're there for, months on end building these houses, are you catching your own food or you're bringing the food with you? Or how do you manage that logistically?
Well, a bit of both. We're on a mutton bird island. So during the mutton bird season, the birds have got chicks from the end of March all the way through April to the beginning of May. So during that period, you can just eat the mutton birds, which was fantastic. But, there's great fishing, and you get to know the island. So there's little coves and gulches where you can catch squid, or where there's mutton fish or abalone you can dive for. Wariness, like there's an abundance of food on Chappell Island. There's heaps of Cape Barren geese, so you could catch the young ones and eat them. So we'd take some food there, bags of flour and sugar and tea and coffee and all that stuff, but a lot of that protein you could get there.
So on Chappell Island, you said that that's there's a big tiger snake colony, and you're also mutton birding. So how did you manage that? Like, how did you?
Yeah, well, I've seen lots of interesting ways of people birding there. Some people wearing kind of big welder's gloves and things like that. But I don't know, there's no real way to do it safely, I don't think. And the reason why people stopped birding on Chappell Island was because there was too many people getting bitten by the snakes and dying. And of course, back then, they didn't have access to, the same sort of emergency response that we do now. But if you're keen to get a feed of birds, and we were, that's our community, eat birds, that's what we do, and we love them. So if you're keen to get birds, you'll always just do it, I don't know if I'd do a whole season there, but certainly get enough for a feed. I think you'd be pretty unlucky if you're pulling a few birds out every now and again to get bitten. But if you did it every day, all day for like 5 weeks,
it's a higher chance.
I think that you might encounter a few. But we got to know the snakes, and we were working on the island, every day. And when I became a ranger, we were moving around the island a lot more and cutting boxthorn and stuff like that. And so, you'd see the same snakes every day, and you kind of get used to them. And the snakes over there, kind of a bit different than here. I think it's because they eat the mutton bird chicks until they're too big to be able to consume. And so the rest of the year, they kind of hibernate, and they're really docile. So these snakes don't get aggressive. Like if you messed with them, they probably would. But generally, you never see them standing up or getting angry when you go past them. They just kind of sit there. So you see the same snakes all the time. You get to know them. You even name them sometimes, and you become quite fond of them. And you soon find yourself in a position of protecting them, because there's people out there who come to the island and try and take the snakes because they're, snake people see them as having a value and having them in their collection. So yeah, we protect the snakes, and look, they're an interesting part of the island, but that's not all that's interesting on the island. It's just an element of it.
Okay. So you spent 8 years working on the islands in different capacities, and then you came back and you wrote this book, Born Into This, inspired by these stories. So what happened? Like, what was it that made you think, I'm going to write a book?
Yeah, I left the TAC in 2008, and I didn't start writing until about 2016, like writing fiction. So there was a kind of big chunk of time after I left doing that work that I started writing, and I never started out to write about those places. I just started writing some short stories because I kind of needed a creative outlet. My life had gone in that direction, and I felt I needed to do something, and other people in my life had creative outlets and I didn't. And I wasn't really interested in what they were interested in, but I've always been a reader, and I wanted to write, and I'd had these aspirations to write for a while, but I just hadn't acted on it. And then, there was a writing competition at a local festival, and I wrote a story for that. And, I got some good feedback on it. There was a little bit of prize money, and then I started writing a bit more full-time. I got a mentorship with a local author by the name of Kate Gordon. And Kate was really helpful to edit my work and give me a lot of great advice. And I think that experience made me want to write more. And so I started writing more short stories because that's the form that I like. And then it wasn't until 2019, I think it was, when I submitted for this great initiative called the Next Chapter, and it was through the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne. And I got it. It wasn't until that I actually started putting a book together, because that was the purpose of that initiative, is to take the manuscript that you've kind of got done, finish it off, and, they paid you a bit of money and that sort of thing, and then try and get published. So I started writing more, and I was just writing about things in my life, because my process tends to be like, I write stories that I like to read. I know that sounds kind of weird. I don't write for another audience, I write for me. And the stories that I was writing, there was quite a few of them that were centred around the islands. And it wasn't because I had the intention of doing that at the time. It was because, like I said, these places had a real impact on me. And after I left them, and I know this sounds strange, but it always feels like, and it still does, that even if I'm not over there, some part of me still is. Because these islands, there's nobody living there. And you go there and you haven't been there for a while, and everything's still the same, and except, a few mice have moved into the hut or something. But everything's still the same. And then I leave, and I kind of feel like part of me's still there. And I think it was that experience that led me to write about those places. They just had such an effect on me. So Born Into This, the collection, there's a few stories. I mean, it's certainly not about the islands, but there's quite a few stories that are based on the islands, and that are perhaps loosely based on some of my experiences over there. I mean, it's all fiction, but, I think as a writer, you're always stealing from real life. You're never really making things up from scratch. You're using your experience, and these amazing places that I've had the kind of privilege to be in. Most people will never get to go there, and they'll never get to see that stuff. So I feel like it's my duty in a way to be able to write about them and take people to them through my stories, because they are private islands and they're Aboriginal land. But they're just so amazing. I kind of want to share it with the world through the stories.
So how, in terms of your process, how do you weave the fact and fiction together?
Well, my son, he's 10, and he's starting to do some writing exercises at school, and he had some homework the other day to write a story, and we were talking about it. And I was saying to him, you can fictionalize real life, and that helps to be able to draw on all the sensory experience in the story, because, if you write about something you've experienced, and you can change the names, you can completely change the characters, you can change the scenario, but when you're describing the environment and the way that you react to things, you don't have to make that up. I think fictionalizing real life really helps writers. I mean, we all do it, but it's a great way to make the work authentic, and that's what people want to read, authentic work. I mean, a lot of the story's made up, but there's elements that are based in real life, yeah.
So when you're writing your stories, have you sketched them out before you start writing, or do they write themselves?
A bit of both. I usually like to know the ending of the story before I start, and I find if I don't know the end of the story takes me a lot longer, and I'll sit on it for ages, and it becomes annoying. But if I have a really clear ending in mind, then I can kind of whip through it pretty effortlessly, which is really handy. And at the moment, I'm writing more short stories, and I'm stuck on a story because I don't know the ending. So it's but that's my process generally to kind of know. I don't map it all out, and I think that if you have a basic story structure, and you start with that, but probably you get to about the middle, and then the characters have a life of their own, and they dictate the rest of the story. And even sometimes if you've got an ending in mind, it can be different, based on how those characters have evolved in the story. And with short form, you don't have a lot of time and not a lot of real estate to develop your characters. So it's a real art. And I think that, if you fictionalize characters you've met, people you've met, and you kind of steal qualities from them, you can make them really develop that way, I think, in a short period of time. Yeah.
So do you keep a notebook and you write like little vignettes, sort of a journal thing for when you meet someone or find yourself in an interesting situation?
I've got lots of notebooks. As a writer, people give you notebooks all the time as gifts and things like that. But I rarely use them because I don't have them with me. So I use my phone more than anything. I just go into the little notes app on the phone, and I write it down. And it happens all the time, and just random places. Suddenly I'll just get a story idea or a little snippet of something, and I'll put it in there. And that's really important. And I always go back to those notes and have a look. I'm actually putting together like a pitch document for a new TV show that I want to make. And I've been really kind of jotting down heaps of story ideas for that, for episodes. So it's a part of my life now, I guess. As a writer, you start to see in your everyday life, you kind of capture the little gold moments, the stories that people tell you, or the things that you see and experience. You go, oh wow, that's great, and you write it down, and you keep that for later. You learn to identify those scenarios that are worth writing about.
It's almost like having a camera with you wherever you go, taking a little snapshot of the scene and then sequencing it.
Absolutely. And, often like I wake up from sleep and I have an idea, some little snippet of a dream or something too. So it's not even just in your kind of day-to-day life. It's even in your sleep. you can find, gold. So in terms of your process, do you have a routine where you write every morning, or are you a bit more organic about the process? What does writing look like for you? Like I have had routines in the past that have worked, and I find the more I write, the easier it is to have that routine. If I have a break from writing for a while, for whatever reason, I find it harder to come back to it. Yeah. In the past, though, I've always been a morning writer. I think my brain just fires better in the morning, and I don't really like writing overnight. I kind of resent it a little bit. I kind of feel like that's my time. Whereas in the morning, especially early, where everyone else is asleep and the sun's just coming up, and you can hear the birds chirping, and I go and sit down at my computer. I think I feel refreshed. The stuff is flowing. I feel calmer. And that's my time to write. And I don't know why, when I sit down to write, often my kind of default is I'm in this kind of almost like a panic state. I don't know how else to describe it. I'm writing, I'm trying to get all the words out really quick. I'm sitting forward in my chair, my tension in my shoulders. I'm looking at the time, and I observe that, and I'm like, why am I doing this? And I try to relax. So at the moment, what I'm doing is I'm trying to implement different things to make writing more of a kind of meditative experience, something that's really calming and relaxed. It doesn't feel rushed. It just feels really organic and beautiful. Like that's my dream writing kind of headspace. It's about, I think, being mindful and being conscious. It's not being rushed and having these deadlines. So I try not to write to deadlines now. I just like to do it in my own time. I find that gets quite overwhelming for me. Like some people, they write in all the creases of life. If they're on the bus, they can write. If they're waiting, if they've got 5 minutes here and there, they can fit in some writing. Well, I'm not like that. I kind of have to be in a zone and then write. I find it hard to shift in and out of writing mode really easily like some people can. So I have to have kind of dedicated writing time. It's just about having this beautiful time and space to write, create a type of meditative experience. And last night I bought this flute. Like I bought it online, I haven't got it yet. But it's this Native American flute. It's made out of this beautiful timber. And it's got 5 holes, and I'm going to learn how to play it. And the purpose of that is so that I can sit there in the morning, I can, kind of have a bit of a, relax and meditate, and I'll play this beautiful flute with this beautiful sound, very organic, and then I'll sit at the computer and I'll write, and it'll flow beautifully. Everything will be gold, and I'll feel really calm, and that's what I want to do. So yeah, that's my process, and it's always evolving.
I like that idea of sort of manipulating or creating, or maybe staging is a better word. I like the idea of staging an environment or an atmosphere to work in, because even when you're writing, you're staging your story, or, if I'm making pictures, you're staging the environment, you're making particular choices. So there's no real reason why you can't stage the environment for your best writing self to come out. So that's quite nice. So you are just finishing off Moonbird, the TV series that you were just talking about. It's a drama.
Yes.
Can you give us a little sneak preview of what the story is about?
Yeah, sure. So Moonbird is an hour drama that was written by myself and Nathan Maynard and produced by myself and Catherine Petman of She Oak Films, and Nathan Maynard directed it. It's a drama. It's set on Big Dog Island, but we've given it a fictional name of Sealpot Island, and it's about a dad and his boy who go mutton birding together for the first time. The dad is an old mutton birder, done it all his life, but he's a drunk, and he's been 12 months sober, and his boy, who hasn't grown up with him, is finally allowed to go with him. So they're estranged. They're there to go birding together, and I guess it's the dad's opportunity in his mind to finally kind of create a relationship with his son. But unfortunately, it doesn't go smoothly. And so, this ideal time to kind of forge a relationship with his boy doesn't happen, and he goes to the pack basically and starts drinking again. And then it's about the kind of boy's journey of discovery around the island, and he finds some old family history that helps him to understand why his dad's the way he is. And there's a lot more to it than that, but it's a beautiful story, and the setting is this beautiful muttonbird island. It's kind of rough. They've got an old muttonbird shed, which they're all like. There's rough shanties, this beautiful, landscape, but it's quite a tragic story as well. But look, it's great. We're not sure when it comes out, sometime early to mid next year. It'll be on SBS and NITV. But yeah, we're really proud of it. We've finished the show. It's been delivered. Yeah, we're just waiting now for it to come out.
Logistically, it would have been challenging filming on an island where there are no inhabitants.
It was. I mean, there's very little infrastructure on Big Dog Island. It's quite close to Flinders Island, which makes, transport of people and gear across a bit easier. But you're still at the whim of the weather and what's going on there and the tides. But yeah, look, there's a homestead there, which is where we kind of created a base of the operation when we had all our production offices and stuff in there. People had to camp, so we had to have a whole bunch of tents and stuff like that. Had the weather been bad, I think everything would have gone pear-shaped, but we were lucky with the weather. We had a crew and cast of about 35 people. So, we had catering and we had all this gear. We had a barge bringing in gear all the time. It was a huge operation. Yeah, look, it was really rewarding. We kind of said to everybody, look, you kind of have to rough it here. Look at it like this, you're going to experience being on the islands like we do. You can see from these old mutton bird sheds how we live when we're here. So just kind of enjoy that experience of being on the island. And they did, absolutely. We had this great weather. People were swimming all the time and fishing and walking around the island. So I think people really engaged with the island, which was great, and have walked away from that job with a really positive experience with us as a production company, but also with this place, this really unique place that most of them will never get back to. So
was the cast all Aboriginal people?
Yeah, absolutely. We tried to get Tasmanian Aboriginal people for the cast, but we couldn't. There's not a lot of our fellas acting down here. The ones that weren't suitable or not the right age, or they were busy. So we had to get people from the mainland, but we got fantastic Aboriginal actors, really top notch, very, very impressive. And we tried to get as many, Palawa or Aboriginal, Tasmanian Aboriginal crew as well. So we had a good crew. It was great. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Just a bit of a side question, but Warwick Thornton, he has this lovely way of directing where he's letting people kind of improvise up to it or respond to the environment with a loose script. Is that how you did it, or was it more mapped out?
Look, it was pretty mapped out. Like Nathan, our director, he had a pretty clear vision in how he wanted the show to look. And I mean, being so familiar with the island and the landscape, we knew what it would look like, but he had some really specific stuff about, what camera lenses he was using and this kind of style of footage and that sort of stuff. And we did have a pretty solid script, but, once you're there, you try different things, and he was open to new things. So some of it is all to script, and some of it has been improvised, or, there's been offers from the cast that really worked, which is great. So it's a bit of both. We went into this show, it's part of the SBS Digital Originals series, and I guess that's designed for kind of new screen practitioners to get a leg up in the industry. And so, the people who run that, SBS and Screen Australia, they want to make sure that you're really organised. Whereas Warwick Thornton's got a lot of things under his belt and has probably got the clout to be able to say, I want to do it exactly how I want to do it. We had a little bit more pressure from the broadcaster and that to kind of, stick to the script, because that's what's been agreed on. But I guess the more stuff we create and the more established we become in that industry, the more clout we have and the more we can do things exactly how we want it. But look, it was a great experience and we're really happy with the outcome.
So how is it different writing short stories for yourself versus a script when you're thinking about a whole team of people? I mean, obviously it's pretty different, but is it very different, or is it?
Yeah, well, we wrote, Nathan and I wrote it together. So that was a new experience for me, because normally I just write by myself and I have the freedom to make the choices that I want to make. So obviously we had to compromise, and it's not always easy, but some of it was, sometimes we, what I really enjoyed was when we sat in a room, usually at my house, and we had a whiteboard and we would just nut out the story, And a lot of the time it's problem solving. You've got this story, but then you you go, oh, there's a plot hole. How do we deal with that? And if we change that, then this is going to change. And so the story did evolve over time as we kind of refined it. And so, it was good. I like working with Nathan, but there was a lot of compromise on either side when, if Nathan had an idea and I didn't necessarily like it, I mean, you can't just keep beating your head up against a wall. Sometimes you've just got to concede and, accept that other idea. And Nathan would do the same with me. So that was okay. I didn't enjoy it, I guess, as much as just sitting down and writing short stories because there was all that other level of complication with two people doing it, but it was still good. And then there was the other part of it of Nathan and I having created a story, and then the people throwing the money into the show, they want to have a say too. And so then there's another level of compromise you have to make with them. And it's a learning experience, but it is very collaborative. I think it's a lot more enjoyable to just sit back and write what you want to write and not have to compromise. And the work is, you feel like the work is fully your own, not like a group effort. Hope I'm not sounding
No. I'm just curious
bad
because,
here, but
because sometimes responding to other people produces something, well, you always produce something you would never make on your own. Sometimes it can be stronger than what you might do on your own, and always it's different. Obviously, the process is different, but I was just curious as to, in terms of how you've answered the question, but how different the process was.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the outcome of the screen stuff is worse because there's more people on it. Like in many ways, it's probably better because there's a lot more refinement that goes into it. I think it's just for me, in terms of what my preference is, my enjoyability is just working by myself.
Matt Newton won the Tidal Art Award, the Devonport Art Award, maybe 10 years ago now, with a portrait of Nathan Maynard mutton birding with his son. Was that story based on, or loosely based on, Nathan?
Not at all. I mean, Nathan might give you a different answer to that question. But no, look, I don't think so. There's elements of the characters, but especially the dad, that Nathan and I probably seen in ourselves in a way. Nathan took his son mutton birding as soon as he was old enough, and his son Clay completely loved it and had always known about mutton birding and had always had access to the islands. And so that's very different than the scenario we present in the story, where the boy and the dad don't really know each other very well, and the boy's never been able to go birding. But I know Nathan felt very strongly about his role as a dad in teaching Clay about mutton birding and about passing on those traditional practices to his son. And I feel that in the same way with my son, who's younger than Clay, but I've gone through exactly the same thing. And it's just a beautiful thing. And we secretly really, really want our kids to take to it. We don't want them to say, oh, I don't like this, Dad. We want them to carry on the tradition. In the same way as the dad in the story, in the show, wants his son to do that. And I won't say whether the kid does or not, but it's a different relationship because he hasn't been around his dad growing up.
So you've probably answered this question in part, but your relationship with Sonny is incredibly special, and he has access to the most amazing experiences. You took him recently on the Three Capes track. He was part of the group of people that returned the petroglyphs from the QV Mag, the Queen Victoria Museum and Art Gallery, to the West Coast. He is right at the front of some of the most significant Aboriginal history-making moments, and he's only 10. So he's having an amazing education. I mean, you've sort of partly answered this, but what's your philosophy of instilling your Pakana culture into Sonny?
Yes, so Sonny's been involved in a lot of those activities. I felt really, I don't know what the word is, very proud, I suppose, to be able to create the opportunities for him to do that. And also, our community and all the work that's been put into, having those petroglyphs returned and all of the background to that and all the work that's been done. And, Sonny's been there when we've dealt with the remains of our ancestors, and there's a lot of work that's gone in for years and years and years to, communicating with institutions that have these remains and constantly pressuring them to having them return. and people going over to, the UK and America and other places and being there physically and putting forward a case. So much work, and then it culminates in these experiences that Sonny's been a part of. And I'm standing there with him, and I'm really proud, and he's experiencing this stuff, that a lot of which I didn't get to experience when I was a kid. So, that's been really like a big part of my life. And I don't take any credit really as being someone that's created that for Sonny. I've just been there with him, kind of guiding him through it. And it's really his kind of connection with our community that's important.
Well, you're strong on culture. Not everybody is drawn to that, I guess. Not everybody's so active in being part of community and wanting to strengthen connections. Right, in your childhood, did you have that same opportunity to be at the forefront of, or have you taught yourself a lot of the culture? You had a good relationship with your grandparents.
Yeah, like as a kid, like no one in my family took me to like marches and things like that. Like I knew people in the community, and I, knew all my family and my extended family and other people in our community, but I guess I didn't have as much of a kind of broad experience with things as Sonny does now, because I'm really involved in my community, and so Sonny is, and I get him along to things, and I take him out of school to go to activities and during NAIDOC week, and anytime there's any kind of cultural things happening, he comes along. I mean, part of that too is I wouldn't say privilege, but I worked at the Tasmanian Aboriginal Centre for 20 years all up, and in the last few years of that, when you work there, you're involved in all of that stuff, and because you work there, you get to go to things in work time. You don't have to take time off. So I guess all of those activities are a lot more accessible than if you worked somewhere else, which is kind of unfortunate. It's certainly not something to blame anyone for. It's just the reality of it, If I was working at McDonald's or at Woolworths or something and I had to, make ends meet, and I wouldn't have time off during the week to go to these things. So working at the TAC certainly made it easier to get along to everything. And so I just take Sonny out of school and get him along to things. But we do things in our own time as well, of course. And I haven't worked at the TAC for, I think, nearly 4 years now. And we still get along to everything that we can. But I'm kind of, not privileged, but I'm in a position to not have to work a day job. So I can still, take time out and be flexible in my time to get him along to things.
When you were talking earlier about the islands, and you were talking about the foundations, the granite foundations on the islands, and that the sheds were no longer there, the mutton birding sheds were not there, there's been a break in culture or history in terms of the use of those sheds, obviously, because they weren't being used. So can you talk a little bit about the start of the Black Wars and also the sealers stories, and just for the listeners who aren't aware, who don't live in Lutruwita and don't know the story?
Yeah, sure. And I'm kind of a bit rusty, but I'll do my best here. So, when the invasion of Tasmania occurred, over time there became a lot of conflict between the tribal people and the European colonisers. And eventually, the government put someone in charge of rounding up all of the tribes and groups of blackfellas that were in Tassie that hadn't been killed or moved on or whatever. And that person was George Augustus Robinson. And he, after these kind of series of military activities in just before 1830, the Aboriginal people finally just, agreed to go with him on the condition that once everything settled down, they could come back to their tribal lands. And so they kind of all went with him, and they went over to Swan Island, which is off the northeast of Tasmania, and they started, a camp there, and that didn't suit. Then they went to, I think it was Gun Carriage Island at the time. It's now called Vansittart Island. That didn't suit. Then they went to neighbouring Flinders Island, to a place called the Lagoons. That didn't suit. And then they eventually went to Wyberlena, where they set up, I guess, wasn't a prison, but it was kind of similar to refugee camp or something like that, where people had forced religion. They had to live in these cold brick buildings. They were, encouraged to participate in agriculture and things like that weren't part of their culture. They were kind of oppressed, and a lot of them died there, really terrible conditions. And I think it was in 1847, the remaining people, there wasn't many left, that all kind of died over there, were sent back to mainland Tasmania. Never ever had the treaty that there had been agreement on, and the remaining people went to Oyster Cove, which we now call Putalina, that's the Aboriginal name, and kind of and lived out their days there. So that's the kind of, very kind of short summary of what happened, to our people in Tasmania. But alongside that, there was Aboriginal women who were abducted or traded or coerced to go with the European sealers to some of these smaller islands around the Furneaux group. And this was kind of early and independent of what was happening with George Augustus Robinson. And over time, there was these island families that were established from these white sealers and these Aboriginal women. And they weren't part of the group that Robinson took over to eventually to Waibelina. And they stayed on these smaller islands, moved around, and they are kind of mainly, I guess, for most of us in our community, where the founding of our families came from. So I'm from the Beaton and Everett families. I know who my tribal ancestors are by name, and I know where they came from, and I know the names of the white sealers that they cohabited with. So we've got a very interesting history, and I suppose, that's why we have a deep connection to the islands. And like when I talked about, those old mutton bird sheds and the old remnants of houses and places on Badger Island that I spent a lot of time on, like I know who was there, and we know from all the history records who had the mutton bird sheds. And we've, gradually sourced all these images over time from people in the community and online of these people in these places. And it's so interesting. And I know that people in our community are just fascinated by this history. And I know Michael Mansell, it's pretty much what he does full time now, is kind of gathering all of this information and trying to collate it into a story that he can have published perhaps, or just present back to our community. Because there's all these snippets of stuff in all these books and genealogies and that kind of thing, but no one's ever really brought it together fully. So that'll be a great resource for the community. These islander families are where most of us kind of come from. Yeah.
That sort of makes the book that you wrote even more potent, really, because even though, it's not all stories from the island, and it's, obviously partly fiction or mostly fiction, you're really drawing on your deep ancestry or deep generations past. And when you say you came back from the islands after working there for 8 years, and the island's inside you, and you're just thinking about, maybe the mice that are in the shed or anything, something like that, then the island's inside you because the island is you, really. Like if your ancestors are all from there, it's like any of us, I suppose, in a different way. But, we are the place that we are from. So all these layers of stories that you're collecting and sharing, it's quite beautiful.
Yeah, it is. And you're right. I mean, there was such a profound effect that they had on me, these islands, that I was compelled to write about them. And I think too what contributes to that is growing up, I spent a lot of time with my great-grandmother. And, she had was it maybe 13 kids or something? So a huge family, and living on these islands in a bag and tent, which is just, a canvas, bit of canvas kind of put over a tea tree frame, like really crude kind of tent, and having all these kids and doing it tough, no money, staying up late at night when all the kids have gone to bed and stringing shells to send over to Launceston in a trading boat to sell for next to nothing, to get some extra money. And there's really interesting stories, that she would tell me, and ghost stories and things that, I was like a lot of my cousins and that never experienced that because they never stayed with her like I did. But yeah, they just had a real effect on me, and I didn't know at the time, of course. But as I got older, and then I got to go to these places and see how life, like what life would have been like, what limited resources are there, but at the same time, what you can, there's a lot of stuff you can live on. But, they're just beautiful, amazing places. And being able to see those old, hearthstones and building foundations, they're just barely there. And you can only find them usually in spring when the remnant garden species are coming up, the bulbs and the garlic and things like that. And so that there was a house there, and if you kind of search around, you'll find blocks of granite and stuff kind of embedded into the earth. And then we know who lived there, and then I talked to my grandmother, and she tells me all about, how she stayed there as a kid, and her aunties, they'd all sleep in the same bed, and she'd reel off all the names of people that were there, and, all these interesting stories. And then that's all in the back of your mind, and then you're on these islands by yourself or with limited people and have all this time to explore. It just works on you. I spent a lot of time there just alone. When the people I was there working with had gone on break, and I stayed there by myself and just walking around the island and finding things, and just, I don't know, it's just stayed with me.
Can you tell that story about you working on the hut and the other builder went off for a few days?
Yeah. So it happened a couple of times, when I was working there with Kerry, and he'd go off for break to Cape Barren Island and I'd stay on Badger. And, you got so used to being there by yourself, often I'd walk around with nothing on. We used to stay in this little hut, and it was just above this kind of high jetty in this beautiful little bay. And I used to keep a fishing rod on the jetty, and I would walk down there and I'd just throw a line in and catch squid and all that. And often I'd just get out of bed and do that and had nothing on. And I remember this one day I did that and had nothing on, and I decided to fish around the cove a bit more. Yeah, I was there fishing, and I was like standing up to my waist in the water, just casting a lure around on this beach. And then I heard these voices, and I looked over at the point, which is quite close, and there was about half a dozen people from Flinders, as it turns out, had just come over for a look. And I had nowhere to kind of run. I was just standing there nude, and I went and talked to them. I think they thought that was a bit strange, but it would have been, this kind of nude guy on an island. But, when there's no one else there, that stuff's completely normal. Other times I'd wake up in the middle of the night and I'd been dreaming of hearing a motor, and then I'd wake up and there'd be one, and I'm like, what's going on? Like, where's that coming from? I'm the only one here. And then I'd kind of look out the window, and a boat would have come in and is in the lee of the island. Just strange things like.
Well, you'd have a really strong sense of privacy when you were there, and then you'd have you'd feel like they were outsiders.
Absolutely. And we had after a while we got a boat, and it was just a tinny, and there's nowhere really to keep boats on Badger Island. So we found this tiny little cove with these rocks, and if we tied the boat up right, it would sit there, but only just, you had to have it tied up really well. I'd go to bed and I'd wake up and it would be windy. I'd walk down there to check it because I needed that peace of mind. And I remember some nights going down there and it's really dark, like no moon. And the shore, the water is just like this glowing blue. Like, what's going on? And it had all these, I don't know what they were, these glowing.
The phosphorescence.
Yeah. And just things like that, like, I've never seen like that in my life. Just weird things, eagles. In one of the stories in the book, there's a reference to the character finding a jam tin full of gold sovereigns underneath this rock wall, talking about, fictionalizing real life. Like, I've never found anything like that, but there's a story that someone buried a jam tin full of sovereigns under this rock wall in Badger, and a few people have looked for it. No one's ever found it. But, you find things like that all the time, weird things, and there's graves, unmarked graves in places, and all of it ties back to these stories that we were told when I was a kid. So, like, really interesting stuff, just Yeah, it's hard to explain to people what it's like there unless you've been there and experienced it.
It feels as though it's limitless. You know, you're in an ocean really at the end of the world, and you've got all these little islands that connect. You can either, paddle there on a kayak or in dinghy, or largely you can go between them. But there's this expanse of sea, and there's also a deep history of culture there. So it must be a very nourishing and imaginative place to be.
Absolutely. And there's so many images, well, not so many, but there's various images from the 1800s of these places and of groups of people getting their photo taken. And so you can go to that, you find them. There's a kind of historic photo on Chappell Island with the Beaton family sitting around this rock, and there's some boats in the background and some mutton bird sheds. And no one could work out where it was taken from. But, when we were doing a bit of a survey with the other rangers around the island, just to kind of document what was left of the mutton bird sheds, we discovered that, we called it Beaton Rock. And we took photos from the exact same spot. And so that became a bit of a hobby after a while of finding these old images and then trying to find exactly where they were. And it's interesting because if there was an old mutton bird shed or something in the picture and you hadn't found the remnants of it before, if you went to those places, you'd always find it. Just, really interesting stuff for me, because it's my history.
That's lovely. I think that's a lovely place to end. Thank you so much, Adam, for coming along.
No, it's been a privilege to share the stories. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to the 6th episode of Art Destinations Tasmania. Be reminded about our next episode by subscribing to our fortnightly newsletter on our website, artdestinations.org. I'm your host, Sarah Rhodes. Ciao for now.